John Egenrode. I'm directly Bradshaw Center for Translational Research. For those of you who haven't met, thank you for being here. This is always a special day for us in the spring because it's the time we have our annual John Doris Memorial Lecture, and I wanted to thank everyone for coming. I wanted to thank Patty Thayer in the back for helping organize this event, so thank you so much, Patty. I want to recognize Ellen Doris is here, John's daughter. If you want to stand up. So we always appreciate it when one or more of the Doris children can come. So it's a really great pleasure today to introduce our guest, Catherine Bradshaw, back to Cornell. I mean, she's very familiar with us. She not only got her degree at Cornell, PhD in 2004, 10 years ago, but toward the latter part of her career here, she was affiliated with the Family Life Development Center, which was one of the two centers that were merged almost 3 years ago to form the Bradshaw Center. And she has fond memories of working in the Mann Library. We had to surge out of the building, if you remember, out of the building that was subsequently torn down into Mann Library. And Catherine occupied some space back in one of these corners in some cubby, and then actually got to spend a little bit of time in BB Hall before she went on to bigger and better things, which I'll talk about in just a second. But now she's obviously gone on and done many other things. She's currently the professor and Associate Dean for Research and Faculty Development at the Curry School of Education at the University of Virginia. Prior to that, she was at Johns Hopkins University, and she retains connections with Johns Hopkins, not minor connections, because she co-directs two centers. She's the Deputy Director of the Johns Hopkins Center for the Prevention of Youth Violence, and she's the co-director of their Center for Prevention and Early Intervention. So she has a commuting professional relationship, and I don't know how she does it, but she does, because she's that talented. On the professional side, she is very active. She's the associate editor of the Journal of Research on Adolescence. She just took on the editor-elect position of Prevention Science, which is the flagship journal of the Society for Prevention Research. And her research has been funded by several federal agencies over the years, including NIMH, NIDA, CDC, and the Institute of Education Sciences. She's gotten several awards. I'll just note a few of them. She's received the SRCD Early Career Award. She's received the Society for Prevention Research Early Career Award as well. She also got the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, and she had to actually go to the White House and visit with President Obama to receive that award. So that was a special occasion. Catherine's been a prolific researcher and author with over 100 peer-reviewed papers and counting, many in the area of school-based mental health promotion and violence prevention. She has quickly become a sought-after expert in these and related areas. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about her research. She'll do that today. But I'm very pleased and proud to have Catherine come back and share her ideas with us about the prevention of school-based behavior problems. So please join me in welcoming Catherine back to Cornell.
Thank you. Well, it's really quite an honor to be back here. A little emotional to come into town last night and have such a lovely day. I got to have dinner with the Hamiltons, who I had worked with when I was here as a student. I also worked with Cindy Hazan, who I had breakfast with this morning, and Jim Carbarino was also on my committee, and I worked a little bit with John and Charlie Izzo, and quite a great team. So it's really very fond, with fond memories and great appreciation for the mentorship and training that I had that I got to come back here. So I've been very passionate about doing youth violence prevention work since I think when I was in high school. Somehow I got the buzz early on. My sister was a psychology major, and she was about 9 years older than I was, and I used to flip through her college textbooks around psychology. So I got really bit by the bug around violence prevention at an early age. People often say, did you have some kind of issue growing up? I was like, not that I know of. I could be repressing it. But I've always been very passionate about youth violence prevention, and was one reason why I came to Cornell to learn more about risk and protective factors around youth violence prevention. And as I started moving on, I started thinking a lot more about the schools as an ecological context for us to try to prevent this type of problem. And in fact, one of the main reasons I did come here is because of the ecological perspective of the school and certainly the department. And we spent some time last night talking about Yuri Bronfenbrenner and the legacy that he has left behind, and I certainly love to cite that I am a grand mentee of Yuri's. He had mentored my advisor, Jim Garbarino, and had indirectly mentored me, sometimes driving him back to his house over at Kendall. I live very close by, so I have very fond memories of him and that philosophy and that perspective, and it's certainly something that I try to infuse in my work. And so I think a lot about the context of schools and how that influences development, either a positive youth development orientation and occasionally a developmental trajectory that might lead us into a more disruptive type of direction. And when we think about schools, I spend a lot of time talking with teachers. I grew up in a whole family of teachers. And when I talk to them about things that they're challenged with, and certainly the people that I work with, they don't say, oh, I struggle to teach this math lesson. They talk about, I struggle to manage this problem, or I have this kid that's really distracting, or he's getting off task and I don't know how to really refocus him. So I started thinking a lot more about prevention in school settings and what the disruptions, even those kind of nip type of behaviors that start off really small, but as we can see from some life course research, even those early onset of aggressive behavior or disruptive behavior problems can really take on a life course trajectory if we don't really try to address them early on. And so when we start thinking about problems in schools, we hear a lot about bullying, and teachers are very concerned about that. And I'll talk a little bit about bullying today, but I really view that as just one set of problem behaviors that often cluster together with other types of disruptions that we see. And not only are these a problem for the kid that's perpetrating the aggressive behavior, but for the other kids in the class. And also the teachers that are trying to manage that environment. I spend a lot of time talking to teachers about how stressful it is to be a teacher and how to manage the environments. So a lot of our models and intervention approaches are targeting teachers, helping them learn to regulate their own emotions and use strategies and reach into their toolkit to be able to manage that environment. And not just in a reactive type of approach, but one around engagement and a positive orientation towards their students. So I'll talk a little bit about some of these themes in the work that I'm doing today. As a developmentalist, you often kind of have to pick an age range, and I've always gravitated towards adolescence, although I've done work in early childhood as well. But you'll see a lot of my work more recently is focused on the middle and the high school setting. And in fact, we know less about prevention of behavioral mental health problems during this particular developmental time period. And when we look at lists of evidence-based practices, most of those evidence-based approaches around prevention of behavioral mental health problems start in elementary school. So we know less about the adolescent context and the context of middle schools and even scarier, high schools. How do we actually implement strategies in those contexts? So from a developmental perspective, a lot of work has gone on, some of which has started here at Cornell, looking at early onsets of aggressive disruptive behavior problems, trying to understand characteristics of kids that might go on to have this developmental trajectory. Sometimes that might be genetic vulnerability. Other times it might be because of risk factors in early childhood. Spent a lot of time thinking about social cognitive factors. In fact, that's what I had done my dissertation on, the way people process interactions with others. So you'll see that as a little bit of a theme from my work. But I've also been very interested in how all these risk factors translate into multiple problem outcomes for kids. After leaving Cornell, I went to a school of public health, and that was a little scary because all of a sudden I was teaching students public health and I had no public health training. So I had to do a lot of very quick learning around that. And one thing I did learn is that, an epidemiologic type of perspective around youth violence, they care less about theories and mechanisms. But that was something that was really ingrained in me when I was here. So I try to carry that work with me, trying to understand how mechanisms really influence the development of these risk factors and translating into multiple outcomes, be it risky sexual behavior, dating violence, peer bullying, even substance use. A lot of those problem behaviors all hang together. We know from some of the work of Dick Jesser and others that when we're trying to develop interventions, if you can hit multiple of these targets, you're actually going to hit multiple outcomes as well. So sometimes I'm talking about drug prevention programs that focus on life skills. but we've actually seen from some research that that can impact violence-related outcomes as well. So I see these as more integrative in nature and more interdisciplinary in terms of my work. Have spent a fair amount of time after working with Steve Hamilton thinking about positive youth development and what are core assets, and did some work with a woman named Nancy Guerra, who was one of my kind of off-site mentors during the time, thinking a lot about core competencies and how can we foster these competencies. And one of the competencies that I really kind of keep coming back to is that connectedness. So you'll see that's another theme about how do we connect with others, whether it's in a mentoring program or how do teachers connect with students, and how do students connect with each other, whether it's to get support when they're going through a rough time, or maybe when they're being bullied by another group and they really need to reach out to help. So I have these kind of themes across the work that I do. But when it comes to intervention work, we'll talk a little about some preventive interventions that we've been using. I like integrating them together and working with really smart people that come up with programs. Somebody actually called me a program broker the other day, and initially I was like, well, should I be insulted? But I kind of like that idea of like taking really smart ideas, or even better yet, components of really smart programs, integrating them together in a blended framework and thinking about more about how you run the program and how it works and for whom it works and under what conditions, rather than developing program X or program Y. So those are some areas of themes that will come out. So I'm going to start off talking in that arc about context, thinking about the school climate, and one of the hot topics that's come up a lot in the media is around bullying. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the work we've been doing in that area. And then I'll go into a series of studies that we've been engaging in, some very long-term studies that I joined, pretty late in the process, and others that I've been involved in launching. And usually we're running randomized controlled trials where, believe it or not, we can convince schools to be randomly assigned to a control or an intervention condition. And I spend a lot of time doing community-based participatory research, trying to convince people that there's something in this for them and get their broader buy-in to the project. Not in a manipulative way, but in a true, authentic partnership type of frame. So I'll talk about a couple of different programs, some of which you might be familiar with, and if not, then you'll learn a little bit about them today. So the hot topic of bullying has kind of come up. It certainly is not a new topic, but is one that's made its way into the press. In fact, on Wednesday and Thursday of this week, the Institute of Medicine is hosting their very first conference on bullying. And so I'm excited to be one of the co-sponsors and organizers of an IOM meeting. The Institute of Medicine, the fact that they're going to actually shine a light on the issue of bullying somehow just elevates it out of being a problem or a kid kind of thing or a parent concern into something that we should really, from a health perspective, be concerned about. And the Centers for Disease Control, Department of Education have been concerned about this issue. In fact, they put together a panel of folks. I was part of that team to really define the issue of bullying. And in fact, after about 3 years of iterating on this process, we went back to the original definition that was put out by a guy named Dan Olveus, a Norwegian researcher who's kind of the godfather of bullying research. And so he outlined 3 kind of core features that I list here. People usually like acronyms, so I write out RIP, R-I-P, but you can think about it as IRP if you prefer that way. But some people, when I talk to schools, they say, well, I don't know if it was intentional, or what does the power difference really look like? Do I wait until it happens twice to really count it as a repeated? And I say, well, take all this a little bit with a grain of salt. We're not trying to accuse kids of this or that, but trying to understand the complexities of these types of dynamics. For example, I'd done some work looking at kids with autism, in particular kids with Asperger's syndrome. They were actually at great risk for being victimized by their peers and bullied, but they didn't really recognize it. And so the question of, was it intentional? Did they really understand that? Did they understand the power differential of somebody that had higher cognitive and social skills ability? So it's really very interesting to think about kids with developmental disabilities in the context of their understanding. And in fact, some of those kids were also bullying other kids because they would learn from watching their peers this maladaptive way of interacting with each other. So why focus on the issue of bullying? Well, certainly it's been in the press. There have been, unfortunately, some school shootings. Another reason why I came here was shortly after Columbine. Jim Garbarino at the time had written this book called Lost Boys that really drew a lot of attention to some of the history and went on to write a series of books around secret lives of teens and things. And so, unfortunately, when these national events happen, they somewhat draw an attention to an issue, and sometimes it's an inappropriate attention because kids are actually safer in schools than they are anywhere else. They're safer in schools than they are at home, statistically speaking. But it's important for us to take these moments as teachable moments, and I think my public health training gave me a little bit more experience and comfort using these media events as a way of launching a research program and being able to raise visibility for an issue. The White House did a conference on bullying, and it was exciting to be there and hear President Obama talk about his own personal experiences with bullying and have other researchers there talking about this issue, and that really helped raise awareness. And certainly there are a number of states, in fact all states except for Montana, have actually passed laws specifically around the issue of bullying. I've been involved in a couple of states that have developed these policies, but they're generally about school districts coming up with a policy. Rarely do they talk about the use of evidence-based practices or actually using data that people can capitalize on to inform their practice. Some have mandated reporting processes. Maryland is one of those states. It's been interesting to be on the cusp of some of these issues around policy. One of the school districts in Maryland I've been working on has been really trying to get out ahead of this issue. And around 2005, they called me up and they said, "You want to help us develop a district-wide system for tracking bullying and helping our teachers learn where bullying's happening, provide training to them?" And I said, "Sure." And so this is like the first grant that I wrote as a new faculty member, and got it funded by National Institute of Justice to help develop this online software system so that way people could track bullying and use it to intervene. And we've been using it annually for about 9 years now and tracking rates of bullying across the district, collecting data from students, parents, and teachers. We annually get about 25,000 students completing the survey across the 117 schools. And it's really been a beginning point for us to be able to monitor rates of bullying and be able to intervene to try to address it at a systemic level and not just at an individual level. So that's been really very fun and has led to a number of publications by our team trying to understand issues around prevalence and risk factors for bullying. And we can see that it is very prevalent. We're seeing about 30% of our students in this particular district, which is not an unusual district. It includes a diverse set of schools that are more urban friends, some rural, and some suburban communities. So we're seeing relatively high rates that do map onto some of the national data around rates of bullying in terms of both victimization as well as perpetration. And in fact, the rates of witnessing are even higher. So that indirect exposure to bullying is also having a profound effect on these students, especially when we see by the time they get to high school. Interestingly, although the rates tend to be higher at middle school, the high school students are really reporting that they're having high levels of exposure. And when we start thinking about its links to school climate, we see pretty much a linear association for both targets of bullying as well as perpetrators of bullying about their perceptions of safety. So the more frequently they're involved in bullying, and you see these lines are relatively parallel. It's only until we get this several times a week that the victimized kids are feeling less safe than the kids that are actually perpetrating the bullying. So it highlights the need to think more holistically about the school climate and the school environment when we're thinking about intervening on bullying behaviors. As I mentioned, one of my interests has been around social cognitive theory. So what about norms of environments and beliefs about hitting back as an acceptable type of response? So there's been a large body of research around norms and how we can target norms as a way of reducing rates of bullying and also changing the norms to be more pro-social, about helping kids out and the way that youth interact with adults. And we see when we break down this sample, this is about 16,000 students, it's middle and high school students only. Our outcome is looking at things like retaliation, so thinking it's okay to hit back when somebody gets in your face, or that aggression is a normative response to someone beating you up. We see that the kids that are involved in bullying is both the target and the perpetrator, the bully victim group here. It's only about 6% of the sample, but they had fairly high rates of these normative beliefs about retaliation, and even higher among the kids that were primarily bullies in these kinds of relationships. So 89% of the kids that were bullies actually thought that it was okay to hit back. So it suggests that we need to be doing more on a wide scale, thinking about how we can change the environment. And adults are an important part in this process. However, when I ask kids about this is about 15,000 students, middle and high school. Have you seen adults watching bullying? About half of them are saying yes. And then nearly 60% are saying that they're not doing enough to stop bullying. And actually, a fair amount of them think that the adults are making the situation worse. But when I ask the staff about this, because I'm very interested in discrepant perceptions, overwhelmingly, 97% say, of course I'd intervene if I saw bullying. 87% think they have effective strategies, and only 7% think that they make the situation worse. Anybody seen the documentary Bully? It's a little bit of a controversial film. I'll talk about that perhaps over lunch, but interesting piece, but it really illustrates a lot of this data because it charts the path of a couple of kids that were involved in bullying and shows some efforts on the part of the staff to try to intervene. And whether it was a lack of connection to the topic or a skill deficit, some of the staff were trying strategies that we know to be ineffective. And it's a fairly poignant movie from that perspective and documentary, so I'd encourage you to take a look at it. When we talked to parents about this, we did a series of studies in Baltimore City trying to understand how parents view the issue of bullying, because when we talk to kids and ask them and say, well, what do you think your parent wants you to do? A lot of kids are saying, well, my parent told me to hit back, and so this is the norm within my community, and this is what I'm carrying with me in the school. And so we often hear from staff saying, well, when I called home, the parent was really chewing me out and saying they're going to come down and you know, threaten me or really want to get after the kid that had beat their kid up. So we start thinking from an ecological perspective. These norms aren't just from an individual, but they're coming from the school as well as from the family. And so we had parents and youth talk together. These were middle school youth, watch a series of videos about different types of conflict, and some involved weapons like a gun, others involved more traditional bullying types of situations. And we had the kids talk about the video after they had watched it together with their parents. And then we separated them out and asked the kid what they thought their parent wanted them to do if they were really in that situation. And 92% of the kids, 92% of the parents advised using violence as a way of resolving that kind of conflict. And when we asked the kids about that, we said, well, what do you think your parent really wants you to do? And they walked away very confused. Well, my parents said, don't get into fights, but if this happened, I should hit back. And so kids are getting a lot of mixed messages, even in the home, about how to resolve these types of things. And some kids don't feel comfortable going to talk to their parents about these issues because they feel ashamed or concerned that they're not going to live up to their parents' expectations. But yet we know parents can be a really important target for our interventions. And so we try to address the home context as well as the school in some of our interventions, and start thinking about how parents are interacting with youth. So as I start transitioning, talking about some of the intervention work we've been doing, we have a series of projects that are funded by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Baltimore City, and we use evidence-based practices and kind of take them into these really live and pretty high violent community settings and try to adapt them to be more appropriate for these kinds of contexts. So for example, when I start talking about bullying to kids in Baltimore City, they're like, oh, bullying, that happens with white kids out in the suburbs. That's not what's happening with me. I'm getting banked. And so we have to shift our language to talk about what's happening for them. And that's where a lot of the youth development and youth voice comes in, is that we need to engage with them and not just take our values from other contexts and impose them in that setting. We have a model we've been working with called Coping Power. John Lockman developed this model. And so we've been adapting that to be more relevant for African American communities in particular, especially those in urban areas, to try to address some of these cultural values and norms and some of the contextual factors that are very important for us to consider. And then we're integrating them with other models like the Oveus Bullying Prevention Program that was developed originally in Norway, but we've seen challenges as it relates to its implementation here in the U.S., particularly in urban settings. So we're trying to import that and adapt it and integrate it within this particular kind of setting. And then we bring in another type of model called Family Checkup, which was developed by Tom DeShawn, where we use motivational interviewing strategies to engage parents in a change process as it relates to their interactions with their kids and management of family conflicts. So you can see we're starting to bundle a whole bunch of models together into more of a comprehensive package, because in these high violence contexts, it's not going to be one single program or one single kind of strategy that's going to do it. You need a whole continuum of different types of supports. And in fact, we're even moving it up to the macro level and looking in the community and using a model called Ceasefire that was originally developed by Gary Slutkin out of Chicago, where you actually have community members, many of whom are former gang members, people that have a history of incarceration, go in and actually try to interrupt that cycle of violence at a community level and change that model. So we're actually doing that at the community level and targeting other kinds of things like inappropriate alcohol outlets that are selling to teenagers in the community. So you start to see this more macro change that we're trying to affect in a high risk area like Baltimore. we've just recently gotten funded to do a randomized controlled trial of this middle school version of the coping power model, so I'm excited to be able to move that out of the city into some other areas. I want to talk about another project that we've been doing in Baltimore City, and it certainly predates me. It was launched by a researcher who actually came to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore from Chicago by the name of Shep Kellum. And so he's a life course researcher and has a theory called life course social fields theory that's pretty commonly cited in epidemiologic research, trying to understand how early risk factors translate through a cascading process or developmental cascade model to subsequent risk behaviors, and that chain reaction occurs. So he wanted to try to test that particular theory by interrupting that cycle and focusing on constraint, so kids' ability to inhibit emotional outbursts and other kinds of reactions. So he came across a model called the good behavior game, although he didn't develop it. He, like myself, likes to work with people that are really smart and develop programs and think about, well, how can we test this or work with this in a particular setting? And so he brought it from a teacher, a fourth grade teacher that had developed this model, into Baltimore City and trained all these first grade teachers in this particular model. And then he started following these kids. Now they're into their early 30s. And he's found significant impacts of this particular model called the good behavior game on a range of behavioral outcomes. And there was a second cohort of kids that was started in the early 90s, and so they said, well, let's see if we target these classroom management strategies to increase inhibition for kids and contrast them with a family kind of intervention. What do we think is actually more impactful? Well, not to be surprised, getting families involved in a universal prevention, so these are strategies to use with everybody, not just the higher risk families. It's a little bit hard to get some of the parents engaged in the family type of prevention, but they had really very significant impacts for the classroom program, the good behavior game model. And so we've been following those kids similarly. So these two cohorts of kids, one started in the 80s and another started in the 90s, have a lot of longitudinal data on them. I had an opportunity to look at the educational outcomes for these kids, even after just 1 year of exposure to the good behavior game classroom management strategy, where you essentially divide kids up into teams and teach them how to provide positive peer support for demonstrating constraint. So what's a little bit challenging for some teachers is we're now counting up problem behaviors that you see for the teams during the process because you want to teach the kids inhibition. And so what they had seen through some other studies is that through this longitudinal process, you're impacting things, not only the constraint, but we know that impulse control is related to academic performance and other kind of positive outcomes. So by the time these kids were 19 and graduated, we actually started looking at things like their standardized test scores by grade 12. And we saw significant impacts for both boys and girls that were what's labeled here as CC, classroom centered. So that's the classroom component of the good behavior game relative to a family kind of intervention where we had counselors providing universal supports to parents around family management. The long story short is we found much stronger effects for the classroom-based piece and less so for the family. Not because families aren't important, but most likely because the parents didn't really engage in the material quite as much. Relatively few actually participated, which piques our interest around implementation. And is this really the right model to use with families? Should we be targeting higher risk families rather than thinking universally? So on the right-hand side here are the effect sizes. So these are showing us that the effect size on high school achievement in the area of reading was a 0.3. That's pretty good for 1 year of an intervention that's relatively low cost. When it got to math, the effect sizes were approximately a 0.42, generally across boys and girls here. When it came to special education services, this is where the money starts running in. You start thinking about cost-benefit analysis. If you can cut down on the number of kids that are inappropriately going into special education, that can have a high return, especially when you couple it. Even if you can delay it a couple of years, that can actually save a fair amount when it comes to cost-benefit analysis. So these are odds ratios here, another indicator of effect size. So we cut by 50% the risk for going into special education with this 1 year of classroom-based supports. And similarly, when we got to high school graduation, the kids in the intervention condition were 70% more likely to go on, actually complete high school, and also some to go on to college attendance. They were twice as likely. We're talking inner city Baltimore. So these are pretty profound effects when you think of 1 year of intervention and 19 years later. So we start thinking, all right, well, what's really happening here? what's happening with these kids is that the classroom that's changing, these kids got 1 year of intervention and they didn't all move together. You know, they kind of fanned out. And in fact, Shep Kellum was so smart and so well connected with the school district, he got the school district to randomly assign kids to classrooms. So that way you didn't even have the natural clustering of this is a good teacher, let's give her all the challenging kids. He got the kids randomly assigned to classrooms. Now that's something I've never been able to get done. I can get them to a condition, but not to classrooms yet. So, you know, it was pretty robust effects. Some of the other analyses that they had done did actually find that the kids that were in those higher risk trajectories, those kids that had an early onset of aggressive behavior that tended to be persistent across time, those were actually where the big movers were. They were the ones that were accounting for the vast majority of these improvements. The good kids couldn't really get any better. It was the high-risk kids. So even in a universal program that we're using for everybody, we find that the impacts aren't actually universal. There's something going on, whether it's a mediator or a moderator, that's differentially impacting how some kids are responding. So in addition to looking at those growth patterns, my colleague Nick Iolango got the great idea of let's connect genetic data on these kids and see if there's something going on. A G by I interaction, gene by intervention interaction. So we partnered with a large group of geneticists to collect data on these kids. Now they're in their early 20s and they can self-consent to providing blood samples so that way we can do the genetic analyses to be able to look at different genetic profiles. And we were particularly interested in a pattern of responding as it related to dopamine, because dopamine is that reward neurotransmitter. And so remember, constraint is one of those targets that we're really trying to focus on. So we weren't fishing here and just putting all the genes in. We're really targeting particular genes. We did spend some time looking at serotonin and haven't found anything as successful as it relates to the dopamine neurotransmitter functioning. So we were looking for a set of different SNPs, so it can go into the details if you're really interested in that. And this is a fairly complex model because the gene by intervention interaction is not a simple 1 + 1. It's a fairly complex profile of different genetic patterns as it relates to the actual pattern of behavior that the child displayed over time. So we used a rather complicated analytic approach that draws upon a number of different latent variable approaches that separates out what we call the trait, so what's stable across time in terms of aggressive behavior, as well as this impulsivity behavior. And then also looked at the state. How much does that change across the different time points? And then had different patterns of these particular genetic profiles. And we found that in fact there was evidence that this particular genetic pattern did moderate the impact of the intervention. So kids that had a particular profile of this genetic pattern related to dopamine receptivity actually were more responsive to the good behavior game intervention. Didn't find anything on the parenting program. Again, it might be because of our dosage issues, because we were taking what's called an intent to treat approach. We were just looking at all the kids based on their random assignment status and not actually taking into consideration fidelity types of issues. But this is exciting for us and pretty cutting edge, and is a paper that's coming out in the journal Prevention Science. I want to acknowledge the first author was one of our postdocs who's gone on to really lead this work. But it's exciting to see that we could try to understand some of the variation in the impacts of programs based on genetic profile. So now I want to kind of move out a level. We've been talking about individual factors in the classroom. Now I want to move out an ecological level kind of from a school perspective to look school-wide. What can we do to try to change some of these norms and promote strategies for teachers about classroom management and connection with students, so that way we can try to capitalize on some of these models of evidence-based practice and implement them school-wide, not just in a particular classroom. And so one model that I've been working with since about 2004 was called Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports. It comes by a couple of different names: positive behavior supports, effective school-wide discipline, a couple of different names. I like to play this game called Positive Behavior Support on the airplane when I ride and sit next to a kid, because there are 20,000 schools across the country that are using this model. And I can ask the kid about 5 questions and figure out whether they're in a school that's implementing one of these models. And the first one is I ask, what are the kind of behavioral expectations? Do you have a code of conduct in your school? And if they start saying things like, yeah, be ready, be respectful, and be responsible, I'm like, cha-ching. All right, we're on to question number 2. What happens if you demonstrate those kinds of strategies? Well, I get a reinforcer that's called a pride bar. And what is the pride bar? Oh, it reminds me that I was meeting that expectation of being responsible. In what kind of setting? So I go through this whole dialogue. And this is just a fun game I play when I sit next to kids on the airplane. Usually their parents are a little anxious at the beginning, but then they kind of figure out where I'm going with this. But generally, it's a model that builds on a lot of basic behavioral theories and social learning theories and about how the school is organized to bundle together a bunch of basic strategies to help teachers remind to have positive exchanges with students and set consistent expectations for students, develop data systems to monitor the impact of their strategies, and identify kids that are needing supports. Pretty basic ideas. And in fact, it's one reason why we think it's very popular, because it builds on a lot of the behavior management training that they've had, but it provides a structure for that and a set of constraints that remind them how to implement these strategies. It has a coaching model, because we know doing all these things is kind of challenging for teachers to remember to do, as well as principles. So there's a nice focus on the implementation support system for this. And there's a data system to be able to track whether kids are meeting those expectations and which kids might need more intensive supports. And so the kids that might need more intensive supports, we bring in this framework around a public health model. So you might be familiar with thinking about primary prevention, secondary prevention, tertiary. Well, it's kind of like that, thinking about a universal strategy. What are we doing for all kids? And probably about 80% of the kids might meet those expectations. But then we might need a tier 2 for the kids that have higher risk. I like these tier 2 kids because they're the fence sitters. They can look really green one day, and then they can look really red one day, especially if the teacher isn't there or something's kind of off. And so those are the kids that need some additional supports. And then there's a tier 3, kids that might need more intensive types of supports. What we don't want to do is categorize kids, and we spend a lot of time making sure we're clear about our communication, that we're not labeling kids in a different bin here, but really thinking about what are the support strategies you're using, whether it be around behavior, social emotional learning, or even around academics. This is the model that teachers use around academics. Like they teach a math lesson. Not everybody's going to get it. You're going to have to give some homework or some pull-out support. Other kids are going to need more intensive supports around intervention. So the same thing can actually apply for mental health and behavior. And that's one reason we think people are pretty responsive to it. The state of Maryland has really picked up this model and scaled it up, as has New York to some extent. There are a number of schools in New York State that are implementing this. In fact, I did a training up in New York for the teachers union. I like working with teachers unions because they need to be bought into a lot of our models. And we've actually been showing that these models have more proximal impacts on the teacher's happiness and success in the environment, and that that's part of our logic model about how we change the environment. We make it a better place for them to work, and then they're more likely to be responsive to the needs of the students. And so in Maryland, we've been scaling up this model, not just as researchers, but working in close partnership with a mental health provider called Shepherd Pratt Health System and our State Department of Education. And each of the 24 local school systems has a PBIS coordinator that coordinates this and integrates it with other models. And this serves as a really nice substrate for us to bring in other evidence-based models and also to do research on the process of scaling up coaching and implementation. So we have a fairly robust team that's working on this that meets. One team meets weekly that I'm part of to talk about its daily implementation, and then the broader team that meets on a monthly basis to talk about integration with other efforts. There's also a National Technical Assistance Center funded by U.S. Department of Ed out of their Office of Special Education Programs that's promoting this model. And one reason that it's also really nice is it doesn't cost anything, because you really have to connect with others that are implementing it and get trained and be part of a network. You can download all the materials in the blueprint for free, and there's a culture of sharing materials rather than buying a shrink wrap product from Hazleton that you have to invest thousands of dollars in. So it's really a commitment towards what's the least we can do in a school that's going to have the broadest impact. So this is just an example of some of the scale up that's been happening in Maryland. So they didn't train 64 or 65% of the schools overnight. It happened in a nice incremental stage here. So my colleague Phil Leaf, right as I was joining Johns Hopkins, had written a grant to National Institute of Mental Health to test this model, because we know not every model that's in wide use is actually effective. If you, for example, were a DARE kid, did DARE at your school, we actually found out through some randomized trials that although DARE was a widely used model, the original iterations of it actually produced iatrogenic effects. It actually made Caucasian males more likely to use drugs than their counterparts in the control condition. It has since gone through a lot of iterations, and our colleagues at Penn State are really trying to rework the DARE model now. So I have to be careful about my broad statements about that. But just because it's widely used doesn't mean it's effective. And so we really needed to make sure that this particular model was well supported. And not being a developer of it, the developers are George Sagai and Rob Horner and other really smart folks out at University of Oregon, have since moved across the country. But we wanted to do a randomized trial of it. And because it's a whole school model, we needed a lot of schools because we need to randomly assign the school to condition. So we enrolled 37 elementary schools across the state of Maryland that were randomly assigned to either the control or intervention condition. And we collected data on them across 4 years, 5 time points. And we captured data on 29,000 students and 3,500 staff. And as I said, we have to make sure that we're actually implementing these things with fidelity. And since this is kind of a bundle or a confluence of a lot of strategies, it makes fidelity a little bit harder. So we send in external assessors to the school to go around and actually assess whether they have the core components. They even interview kids, and they talk to parents and talk to staff, look at materials, even do chart reviews to make sure they're really implementing the strategies. And so you can see our control condition here are the ones in blue. They're not starting off with 0 positive behavior supports. They're on average using about 40% of these elements. We see a little bit of inflation over the time, and we think that's because they were responding to some of our questions. From their perspective, Johns Hopkins researchers came in and asked me what data system I'm using. Next year I should probably get a data system together because it sounds like that might be a good thing. We would often make jokes kind of in poor taste that we should throw on bad things like, can you show us where you lock up the children? You know, not that that's a good thing to do, but it would have helped us kind of make sure that they weren't just following our lead in terms of figuring out what the intervention was. But you can see after the first year, about 2/3 of our schools in the train condition actually met high fidelity. Took all 4 years for one of our schools in the intervention condition to actually make that 80%. But there was high level of sustainability. And this is just at that tier 1 piece. We didn't get into the advanced tiers just yet. We've gone on to do that in other projects. This is just a little bit of detail. As I was saying, one of our proximal impacts is the way that we're improving the organizational health of the school as reported by the staff. So we use multi-level modeling to adjust for clustering and all those types of things. And we had those 3,500 staff members report on a variety of different areas, how the school's functioning, how the principal's leading, how they're communicating with other staff, how they're focusing on students and developing relationships. And so through our analyses, we were able to actually show that there was a baseline, no difference between the two conditions. But notice these are very subtle differences that actually span out. In fact, it took about 3 years for us to actually reach a statistically significant difference between our control teachers and intervention teachers as it relates to changing climate. But climate change is a pretty big thing. You're not going to be able to change that overnight. So if it takes us 3 years, and in fact the mantra is often a 3 to 5 year investment is needed to really be able to see the discernible impacts of the model. It took us about 3 years to see changes on the overall scale of organizational health. But as it relates to principal leadership, so this is the staff report that the principal is doing a good job leading the school, that actually took us 4 years to reach that kind of significant impact. What was also kind of interesting, and this summarizes just some of the effect sizes. So we saw an effect size about 2.4 to 3.5 in terms of the impacts on the teachers' reports of the organizational health of the school across a wide range of dimensions. And what was kind of cool is I was interested, what about those schools that looked pretty good from the beginning? You know, how much did they change? Getting back to that, what works for whom under what circumstances? Now we're thinking about what works for a school. Well, in fact, the schools that were organizationally healthy at baseline, they implemented PBIS pretty quickly, and they didn't really change very much as it relates to the indicators of school climate here. But what we did see is the schools that started off pretty low with organizational health, took them longer to implement the model, but they actually changed the most. So that I'm not ready to kind of say, let's go into our most chaotic schools and implement this model, because integrity is a bit of a challenge in some of those settings. But we do start thinking about, well, is this really the right model for a particular school under that kind of framework? As it relates to students, we also saw significant impacts on outcomes for students. about 1/3 of a reduction in suspensions, about 1/3 of a reduction in office referrals, and we saw significant impacts on the state standardized tests. So again, these are kids across the 37 elementary schools. About half were in the control condition and half in the intervention condition. And then we had teachers' ratings. So some people say, well, you know, a principal can kind of manipulate some of those data systems to maybe make things look a little bit different. But then we had a teacher, for every teacher filled out a checklist on all the students in their classrooms across those 5 data points, 4 years, 5 data points. And we were able to look at changes that were happening in the classroom for the individual students. We first started off looking at bullying behavior and found what is a little scary here. You're seeing all of these kind of go in the bad direction in the sense everybody's getting worse over time, at least as the teachers are rating them. But what you're seeing is the kids in the PBIS condition are getting less worse than the kids in the control condition. And so we had these longitudinal data on kids in kindergarten, 1st grade, and 2nd grade. So that way they were followed through the project. If a kid was in 5th grade, we got an initial teacher rating on them, but we didn't follow them after they moved to middle school because of resource issues. But these were kids that were staying within those schools. So we also saw a very similar impact for rejection. So the kids that were in the PBIS schools were rated as having less peer rejection or bullying as compared to those in the control condition. Interestingly, we got an intervention by kind of age level finding here, such that the younger the kids were when they were first exposed to positive behavior support, the stronger the impacts. So that says to me, I'd rather start my kid off from the very beginning in a PBIS environment, because then they don't even really know that this is a thing. They just think this is how schools work. And so it becomes the norm about how schools operate. So this is something that says to us, we should really try to start these models early on. And there are even some early childhood kind of extensions of this. Similar types of improvements as it relates to disruptive behaviors, teachers' ratings here. Concentration problems, so these are those kind of impulsivity types of things I was talking about before as it relates to the good behavior game. Emotion regulation, so these are good things, so that's why you see it kind of going down, sadly. Teachers were less likely to rate the kids as having emotion regulation skills as they got a little bit older. We've been trying to understand that, but that's kind of common in other types of studies. But again, the PBIS kids had better ratings than the control kids. And teachers reporting a pro-social behavior, so we weren't just looking at bad stuff. We wanted to see not only the brake pedal, but also the gas. Are they using good things in these types of environments? So in summary, we found significant impacts of the teacher ratings on the students' outcomes across a wide range. And that's really kind of nice because it's showing us it's not just localized to one particular thing, but we're seeing that broader impact across a range of outcomes for students. Also, we started looking at things like counseling use and special education service use. We found the kids in the PBIS schools, because they were getting that universal level of support, required less of those tier 2 and tier 3 types of supports. So that's what we want to do, is essentially grow that green zone. What I fear is in some schools that don't have a universal system of support, they're kids that really should be green zone kind of kids, but they look yellow or look red because there's no organizational structure in the school. So we really want to grow the green within this context by having these universal types of supports. We brought in another trial where we started to look at the tier 2. So what do you do with these kids that aren't responding? And so we really wanted to kind of understand the variation in the impact of these models. So we took another approach, and this might look a little scary, but what we did is we took the baseline scores that the teachers gave the kids on these ratings, the teacher's classroom observation. And so the teachers gave a baseline score, and we disaggregated the kids into groups. I thought there might be kind of a green, a yellow, and a red, but we actually ended up with 4 groups at baseline. So these concentration problems are the more problematic and disruptive behaviors. So you see the red group, relatively small, about 6.6% of the sample. They had high, i.e. bad scores on concentration problems and disruptive behavior, and really low scores on the good things, the prosocial and emotion regulation. You see the blue group is the mean-centered, so those are the kids on average, the kind of normative class. They were about 36%. You get a yellow zone group here that's that at-risk group, 23%, and the green group, this is of course where my kid is, the socially emotionally skilled group. They were, you know, above the mean in the good stuff and below the mean on the bad stuff. And what we found is it's really that yellow group in this particular study, much like we had seen in the good behavior game where it was those higher risk kids that were benefiting, we're finding that also here, that it's those higher risk kids that are actually benefiting the most from the intervention. So when we disaggregated our sample into these risk categories, we were actually able to see the ones that improved the most were the ones in the yellow and the red categories. So they were less likely to be sent to the principals than the yellow and red kids essentially in the control condition. They were also less likely to be referred for special education or to be retained a grade within school. So this fits within a model in education called response to intervention, if you've heard of that. So where you have a universal type of level of support, and then you're looking to see who doesn't respond to that, because that gives you an idea of who needs that tier 2 and tier 3 type of supports. And as it relates to the tier 2 types of supports, we got another grant to bring in coaches to work with the schools to decide what to do with those kids that were at risk. So in this case, we enrolled schools that all had universal training in positive behavior support. So they all had a good green zone. They all had our fidelity benchmarks around having at least 80% of those core features. But we wanted to see what were they doing at that tier 2 level. And so we had coaches that went around and worked with these schools, carried a caseload, and not of seeing individual kids, but a caseload of teachers. So it was not a direct service model. They didn't interact with students directly at all. That's not what we're testing. We're trying to empower the school staff to have a sustainable model for addressing these needs. And so we provided coaching and professional development, even brought in some themes around cultural proficiency, because we were noticing in the data that unfortunately our students of color were more likely to get office referrals and get suspended, even after having that tier 1 level of support. So we thought we needed to do something more directly to try to assess that. So in terms of our outcomes for this particular project, we had 42 elementary schools. We followed for a shorter period of time, just 3 years in this particular project. It was largely because of the funding. And we found, interestingly, we saw that the teachers improved in their ability to manage behavior problems. They had greater efficacy, thinking that they could manage them better. They also had students that, again, were growing that green zone. There were fewer students that needed classroom-based supports and other kind of pull-out supports. In fact, we also saw another reduction in special education referrals, as well as teachers' improvements on ratings of academic achievement. So bringing in that tier 2, we are getting an added benefit beyond just that tier 1 level of support. So we've been kind of taking this positive behavior support framework as a little bit of a theme that we can do variations on. And I mentioned that we had seen some overrepresentation of students of color in our discipline referral data. Well, we're not the only ones. Nationally, we know that there's an epidemic around this, and we're very concerned. And we have very few tools in our toolkit around cultural proficiency. There are a lot of models, there's a lot of professional development, but I challenge you to find one outcome study that has a rigorous design that actually shows that any of those models have improved outcomes for students. So we wanted to develop one. So we brought in the Universal Positive Behavior Support Framework and brought in coaches to work one-on-one with teachers to help them learn culturally proficient strategies for managing challenging behaviors and teaching across difference. We brought in a coaching model called the Classroom Checkup that uses motivational interviewing and provides teachers feedback on data so that way they can look, this is an area of strength for me, this is an area of challenge. I want to be able to focus on this and set attainable goals and through their work with the coaches around this. We brought in a particular framework that we call Double Check, where we have a CARES model, and that involves connecting to the curriculum. You can see that theme around connectedness kind of getting picked up here. Forming authentic relationships with students across difference. Reflective thinking. Interestingly, a lot of the models around cultural proficiency only focus on reflective thinking. Where am I? What is my background? What is my history of power and privilege? And what we're challenged with is teachers come out of those sessions sometimes feeling guilty, feeling privileged, but having very few strategies about what to do. So we're a very skill-focused type of approach here. So help teachers think about how they can reflect on their own background. And we even brought in strategies of mindfulness, helping teachers become aware of the stress that they might feel, like when they see a student that's being disrespectful for them, what their body language does and how they're responding to that, to get more in touch with their own physical and even physiological responses to that type of interaction. And similarly, think about the stress students might be feeling in that context. So there's a little bit of mindfulness-based coaching that's used in this model. Effective communication, we talk about issues of code switching and background and helping kids understand as well as helping teachers understand these concepts. And sensitivity to cultural backgrounds. What we did not want to do, and we were very clear about this in our communications, is we didn't want to say, this is what you do with African American students, this is what you do with Latino students, this is what you do with Asian students. So we have a very integrative type of approach. And we happen to be working in a school district that's under a NAACP negotiated agreement for a lawsuit around disproportionality. So it's a very emotionally charged and high visible issue within this particular district. But we've found quite a groundswell for this particular model. I was saying last night, this has been the most challenging project for us to work on, but it's also the one I get the most calls for. Whenever I present at a conference, I get calls from California, Michigan, Chicago. Got one just recently from the state of Georgia. They want to build us into their model. I'm like, we haven't done the trial of it yet. We don't really know if it works yet. And they're saying they're just so hungry for any kind of strategy that's positive rather than punitive and really empowers teachers and is more skill focused. So that's one of the models that we're working on now. We're currently doing a trial of this model to see whether the coaching model enhances the outcomes for students. And I always get the best ideas from the people we work with in the schools. One of our principals said, yeah, this is great, but what's going to happen when you leave? What if you coach 2 teachers at one time and then they coach each other? I said, oh, that's really a great idea. So we wrote a grant to Spencer, and they gave us additional money to bring in 2 teachers that we coach simultaneously. So that way, when our expert kind of coach phases out, they can continue to coach each other along that process. So it's been really interesting to try to play around with this model and infuse things like database decision making and motivational interviewing into the coaching process. So I'm going to wrap up by talking just about one last project that's at the high school level, because high schools are kind of this whole other beast. We have done a lot of work with positive behavior support at the elementary school level, but there really hadn't been any other studies to say, what does this look like at a high school? You know, can you set that reinforcement system the same way? What about youth voice? How do we tackle other more challenging issues like substance use in this more comprehensive framework? So we received a grant in conjunction with our State Department of Education to do a randomized controlled trial of this model at the high school level, where we brought in a menu of evidence-based practices, some around bullying prevention, some around mentoring, substance use, even a Tier 3 model called Cognitive Behavioral Interventions for Trauma in Schools, CBITS, if you're familiar with that model. And so we, rather than saying everybody had to use all these models, they got to collect data on school climate using an online data system, get coaching from what we call a school climate specialist to help them decide which of those evidence-based practices they want to use in their school to meet their unique needs. So we work with them over a period of 3 active intervention years following a baseline data collection year. And then we've been monitoring not only what programs do they choose, how well they implement them, but what impact they're having on the students. And so there was random assignment, and we have a sampling approach within this model because we can't collect data on all those kids. Most of the schools are pretty large, so we collect data on about 25 classrooms per school that are randomly selected. And this is the great state of Maryland, kind of a funny state. Some joke that we got all the parts that nobody else wanted because Washington, D.C. is right down here, Virginia is here, and then you've got Pennsylvania, Delaware. So it is relatively a funny state. But I put this up here because when we're talking about high schools, we've got a lot of geographic dispersion here. So I've got more rural areas down here on what we call the Eastern Shore, because that's where the Chesapeake Bay area is. Western Maryland is a little more like Virginia, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, a very rural kind of area. And then right there clustered in the middle is our Baltimore County, Anne Arundel County, our more urban kind of central area. This is right outside of D.C. and is more of a larger kind of lower income area in Charles County. So when we're collecting data, we're trying to move all over the state. And we've had a real positive orientation towards our engagement of youth. So in fact, we had a youth advisory board, and they came up with our slogan because we needed to get their input about how this was really going to work. And they came up with this theme: what kind of school do you want your school to be? And they even did a video. We had an acting troupe that did a video that shows up when they go in to do the school climate survey, so that way they can really engage other students in the change process. And their student committees and things like that. These are not real people, as you can imagine. These are not our real people. But we do have real kids that are part of the team. We have posters that are posted all around. We're using the U.S. Department of Education's model of school climate. We have these 3 different themes: engagement, safety, and environment. May not have been the model I normally would have chosen, but since they were our funder, it seemed like a good idea from a grantsmanship perspective to say we were going to test their model. And so they've actually are interested in developing a national model for school climate assessment, and they've been looking at our particular framework through that process. But you can see these issues of connectedness are very central to our particular model around engagement. We have data from the school climate survey, and we present everything back to the schools. They can access it online to facilitate database decision making, and it's broken down by our 3 domains of safety, engagement, and environment. And what's really eye-opening for a lot of our schools is they've never really looked at some of these data before. For example, 21% of the students saying that they often or very often feel sad. Most teachers are thinking, that kid's quiet, I'm not going to worry too much about it. But this really, having these kind of data open their eyes. Also, when you look at the substance use, so very high rates of 82% of students said that substance use is a problem at their school. 61% said that students of all races are treated equally. So you can see a lot of issues of equity that we're trying to address here. We've also been very interested in the physical environment. Now just talk briefly about where we are and trying to assess from kind of an ecological perspective the school environment. These are some snapshots of some of the high schools that we're working in. And you can see just a little bit of differences across them. Some have bars on the windows, some aspects of the school. So we got a grant from the William T. Grant Foundation to layer on to this high school trial to see if we could send in outside observers to try to ferret out different aspects of school climate from an outside perspective. So we went into the classrooms and did observations of students' engagement and students' interactions with teachers and teacher behaviors. We observed students in non-classroom settings. And then we also developed a measure that focused on the more physical aspects of the classroom, so in the school environment. So are there security cameras, are there bars on the window, broken windows, those kinds of things, to try to assess, also looking at evidence of substance use, so cigarette butts, other kinds of bottles and alcohol and things like that that we could see. So very interesting. We collect all this data using handheld devices, and as you saw, we're fanned all over the state, so we have to send observers out to these schools that we give background checks and all kinds of rigorous training to. And they transmit the data back to us, and then we analyze it. And importantly, we report all that data back to the schools. Admittedly, we can't report 352 items from our observational system. So we've, through an iterative process, have pulled down the handful of items that we actually get back to them. But it illustrates our commitment to not just pulling the data out and taking it as researchers, but putting it back in the hands of the schools. So this model is still something we're doing an ongoing trial here. Here's a snapshot of some of the data we do share with schools. So you can see the red are kind of bad things and the green are good things. So 60% of our schools are posting positive expectations for students. A fair amount, 40% are posting bad things like no bullying, no drugs. Those are kind of things we want to move away from the no, no, no list. We want to go with the go, go, go list. And promoting healthy eating because we have a holistic model. Students' work, this is another sign of engagement. So these are just some examples of some of the observational data that we're collecting. And finally, we've also kind of moved to another macro level where we're using GIS data. So we've mapped out other kinds of resources in the community. This is one of our districts around Baltimore where we've mapped in red the schools where they're located. And this is an example of alcohol outlets, so where they're selling alcohol. Because you would assume, and as we hypothesize and have shown to be true, the closer the alcohol outlets are to where the schools are, the higher rates of substance use. We've also mapped positive things like youth development centers, churches, and are looking at how that relates to positive outcomes for students. So this is kind of moving up to a much more macro level as we wrap up our discussion here. So we've learned a lot of lessons through this process. One, that we can do prevention programming, we can achieve outcomes for students. Leadership and buy-in is critical, as is high quality implementation. We also need to think a lot about coaching models and providing training to people across all grade levels and thinking about how the data systems are used to inform practice. So I'm happy to stop now. I know there were a couple of questions that might have come up along the way, but I'm happy to pause here and take some questions. Yes, we've had a very patient person on the back row. I want to applaud you. Thank you.
Hi, I just had a couple of questions. One is, did you get any pushback from teachers, principals, superintendents saying, it's too much in our curriculum, we don't have time for this?
That has become more of an issue this year for us, frankly, because Maryland is adopting Common Core, and there are the park assessments that are all online. And so since our data collection efforts are online, there have been some scheduling challenges around that. We've also had really bad weather this year in our area, which most people are just somewhat slightly inconvenienced by, but we have 3 randomized trials going on now, so that really puts us behind. So this year I think has been a bit more challenging, mostly because of the rollout of Common Core and some aspects of the weather. So the positive behavior support, what's really nice about it is just infused in. You don't actually spend a whole lot of time doing it. So you teach the children the strategies at the beginning of the school year and revisit it pretty regularly. Quite often principals would talk about the expectations when they do their morning greetings. They'll remind students about the expectations, and they'll talk about if there's going to be some kind of recognition process, collective or individual, so they'll refresh that. So you got to keep it fresh, and there's school teams that facilitate that process.
My last question is, do you have any plans to test these kinds of things in charter schools, private schools, alternative schools that might have a tougher population of students?
Yeah, so I think those are really important settings. I had done a lot of work in alternative settings at one point. One of the challenges from the research side is alternative settings are all a little bit different. In fact, part of my kind of master's program, I evaluated an alternative program through BOCES up in the Horseheads area. And that was a very unique program, and it was hard to find another program that was like that. So we haven't had as much of a focus on that. We have had some charter schools in Baltimore City that are participating. There's a high rate of charter schools there, KIPP schools and other kind of local charters. Yeah, so they've been interesting to work with. Again, there's some challenges because the models are a little bit different. Interestingly, we got approached by the Catholic schools. That's been fun. So the Catholic schools approached us and wanted to use our school climate survey system and get trained in Oveus. So we have been working with them to scale up this particular model. They were particularly sensitive to some of the questions on the survey to make sure that they weren't on issues that conflicted with the value system of the Archdiocese, but we're certainly happy to talk with different districts about different models. But generally, we've taken traditional school settings for these. In Baltimore City, we have a lot of K-8s, and those kind of can take on a little bit more of a charter type of context. But we're very interested in thinking more about charter.
My last little teeny question is, I know there's a lot of diversity issues in this curriculum. Are there disability awareness and advocacy issues in your curriculum?
When we started rolling out the cultural proficiency training, we started with disability, and we also started with military as kind of a population. Part of it was just like a warm-up of like, oh, are we really ready to go there? Why don't we talk about other cultures and contexts? So we did talk about those, and certainly that's part of the Oveus bullying prevention program. But more recent iterations, we've gone more directly to cultural differences as it relates to race and ethnicity, because we found that people were like, oh, I've got a couple of kids that are, Mormon in my class, and, that's really very nice, but that's not where the disparities are. And so we found that teachers were kind of hanging on the fringes of those kind of other cultural populations and weren't really getting to the difficult conversations. And so we spent some time with that as kind of a warm-up, but more recently, because of the greater focus on cultural differences and ethnic differences around disparities, we've kind of gone a little bit more directly to that and then kind of fanned out rather than started broad and gone in. Thanks. Charlie.
So the programs like this and a lot of programs that are disseminated have a significant data collection and need that component to them that requires resources. It's a source of a lot of grumbling within organizations. I'm wondering, are you sold on the value of that level of operation that has to be incorporated into these programs? And if so, where is the best action in terms of the real value to schools? Now, setting aside the value to us as researchers,
Right.
or the value to the organization to be able to say, we're collecting data, we check off that we're doing evidence-based programming, we're showing that we've move the mark so we can get more funding. It's that aside, in terms of data to actually help them understand what's really going on in their school and to be able to chart the course for next steps about how to improve what they're doing. Are you sold on the value of the data?
I think that the data, I'm kind of a data guru, so we got to put that aside. I'll just put that out there. But I feel like the data helps with buy-in across multiple levels. So for example, when we talk about presenting the bullying data back to the school, when I come in with national data from some other community or some other school, they disregard it. They're like, that's not our school. But when you come in with their own data, and I do that slide that I had here about comparing what the kids say and the staff say, when I do that with your own data, that's when everybody sits up in the chair and starts listening, and that's when the conversation starts happening. So I think when the data are local, it helps with the buy-in and helps with the ownership of the problem, because when I come in with the national data, people disregard it and say, that's not my school. And so that can be really, I did one session, I don't do all the trainings myself for sure, but I do them occasionally to stay connected. So I did one for our schools, and the principal was there, and there was a question about the principal supports you in your implementation of behavior supports, and the staff kind of panned that item. It was like 23% agreed with that. And he was there, he was brave. He kind of came up at the end. He was like, Catherine, I really want to thank you coming in. It looks like I've got a lot of work to do. Let's talk about this. And so that started a dialogue while I was there, and while he kind of got his eyes open from talking with the staff around it. So I think it's helpful at different points. One is around buy-in to get them motivated to do something. I talked a little bit about our coaching model for individual teachers, where we're using that motivational interviewing, the classroom checkup. Our coach goes in and does 3 observations in the classroom, plus an initial interview, and does an observation of how they've set up their classroom, and then presents data back to them in a very intuitive green, yellow, red. Like, these are your areas of strength. These are the areas of possible concern, and these are the areas where you tend to be a little bit lower than other teachers. What would you like to do? And then the teacher picks what areas that he or she wants to focus on, develops an action plan, and is able to implement it. I think without that data, they wouldn't really get it. And so the data, you and I were chatting about this earlier, tends to be, the more behavioral it is, when we say, I observed your classroom for 15 minutes, and I saw that you used 1 incident of praise, and there were 17 punitive statements. That's a ratio of 1 to 17. We usually like to have 3 or 5 positives to 1 negative. That's the kind of recommendation. Ironically, it's also the recommendation in romantic relationships, although Cindy isn't here. I did notice that 3 to 5 positives to 1 negative is something that shows up not only in classrooms but in relationships. So, you know, the data are helpful, I think, for the teachers to say, I didn't realize I was doing that. Or I didn't realize that I was using that kind of facial expression when I responded to this student relative to that student. So that kind of feedback, I think, there's one of our researchers is really interested in what is called microaggressions. So we've tried to train our observers about microaggressions. So essentially, when working with particular students, often they tend to be students of a different background than the teacher, she might or he might use different kind of facial expressions that suggest some level of disapproval or tension. You know, some of this can get really Freudian if you get out there, but giving people feedback around those types of things from an expert that's there as a shoulder to shoulder and not as a punitive kind of support process. We also have we have an arrangement with the principal in our coaching that the principal doesn't get access to the data, it's the teacher's data. The teacher can choose to share it with the principal, but we don't share that data with the principal. So I think that those are important. On a macro level, I think being able to chart progress towards goals, setting goals. Our data collection systems are pretty efficient. You know, I know it takes 7.8 minutes for a kid to complete our survey system because it's web-based and we know how long it takes. So, you know, we have pretty precise data about that. So I think the data is helpful. I think sometimes there can be a little bit of a novelty wear off. You know, they like it at the beginning and then there can be a slide off, but that's why you got to keep it fresh. Like our students, actually, I do focus groups with the kids and ask them to help us process the data, and they like that. They're like, I didn't think anybody was actually looking at this. And they, the students, especially in the high school project, are taking the data and putting it in student newsletters, so that way they can help get buy-in for it. We also have parent data that comes in, so the parents put it in their own newsletters, so they like that data.
One thing I'm hearing is the data that was most useful, if I heard you right, is the stuff that describes what they're doing, how they're doing their work, as opposed to just the count of bad things that happen or the number of, I mean, maybe just both things are
They like
valuable,
the
but-
bad things too,
They
just to
like the
kind
bad
of know.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's better. They like the counts rather than the global assessments.
Yeah, okay.
Well, let's take another maybe question, because I know some people have to leave, and we do want to invite everyone who can stay for lunch. They're setting up in the back, our caterers. Notice there'll be another minute, it looks like, before they're ready to. But let's have one more question, and then that'll give you opportunity to people that do have to leave. You can gracefully duck out of the room. Others could come up. I'm sure Catherine is willing to talk one-on-one with people until lunch is ready. So is there one more question before we have a break morning?
Catherine, I'd love to talk, but following up from Charlie, the kind of data that Charlie's saying seems to be really useful and helpful, and the partnership, that's expensive data. There's a lot of money that has to go into collecting that. Could you just say something about all of these different grants of contracts you've had to do this? Has anybody given you any pushback on the amount of money you would need to be able to collect that kind of data?
So in the positive behavior support framework, there is a operating system called SWIS, School-Wide Information System, that schools can use to track their office discipline referrals. A SWIS license costs $250 a year to do, so when you're setting up your budget for any kind of program around positive behavior support, some districts have actually developed their own data system, and others have said, well, you're going to be entering this data anyway, let's have it import into a data system that's going to give you better usability in terms of graphs and things. So that just gives you a number. And our survey system, because we got a grant from the federal government, our charge was to develop a statewide system for assessing school climate that would be sustainable. And so we put in all the work to do all of that, and we've had several projects to do that. So now at the end of the project, I essentially am kind of slush funding ways to be able to sustain it, but we're in a process now that we're not actually going to charge any of the schools for that. I think the real cost for the school is more logistics, so getting kids into the lab, creating times for them to actually do the online survey. Baltimore City does a pencil and paper survey system because they don't have the online data collection, and they spend probably over $1 million just doing that pencil and paper. And they've got some PR issues as it relates to parent involvement, and so they've really pushed and spent a lot of money to get parents and actually mail things home and track things down. Parent involvement is really pretty low in a lot of these survey systems, so some people say, is it really worth the investment, or putting a lot of incentives around that? I think the return on investment for the parent data is pretty low. Sadly, I'd like to find other ways that we can get parent investment, but I think collecting data from the students is much more economical than the others. Some of our school systems have said, well, should we just go to every other year? The problem with the every other year model is you don't really get it to be able to action plan, because it's like, oh, that was data last year, so much has changed, I don't really know what's happening this year. So in terms of the fidelity checks for some things, that's another cost. Each of the districts has a program coordinator on positive behavior support, and so they spend about a day each year going into each of the schools to assess fidelity. We pay for that externally as it relates to our randomized trials, because we want somebody that doesn't work for the district and doesn't know the intervention condition. So we're in the process of doing cost-benefit analysis right now, and there are some analyses already in existence around cost-benefit analysis for positive behavior support out of the Oregon Center. I can send those to you. So, in our case, we've developed the systems so that way we can move them over and have them be sustained by the district at low cost, because we've done all the investments there. But other schools, to kind of develop those systems from scratch, would be fairly costly for them to do.
Thanks so much. So thank you for staying.